The old mansion on the outskirts of Charleston stood as if forgotten by time, with peeling stucco, creaky floorboards, and windows that reflected the shadows of the past in the evenings. Jonathan Gray, a former neurosurgeon now living a secluded life, rarely left the walls of his house, which seemed both a fortress and a prison. After the fire that took his wife Rachel, he stopped letting anyone into his space except doctors and staff. He considered this a necessity, not a weakness but a precaution. The fire was no accident. At least he wasn't sure it was just an accident. That night, 3 years ago, the house had gone up in flames in an instant, and it was only by a miracle that their 5-year-old son Elliot had been saved. Jonathan couldn't forgive himself for being away on business when it happened. Since then he had lived with the constant feeling that something worse could still happen. Elliot now suffered from chronic respiratory syndrome, which was particularly severe at night. Doctors attributed this to post-traumatic stress combined with a weakened immune system. Every evening was a test of endurance for Jonathan. The alarming signals from the oxygen monitor and the sudden coughing from the children's bedroom made him jump out of his chair. He never slept soundly. Most often he dozed on a couch near the screens with surveillance cameras installed throughout the house. The monitors were on around the clock. Any rustle, any movement caused him to feel tense. He didn't trust the security system or the staff. He only trusted the recordings. Changing caregivers became a regular occurrence. Most didn't last longer than 2 months. Either they weren't qualified or they got annoyed by the pressure, or they left without explaining why. But the day before, when the agency sent a new candidate, Jonathan felt something strange. Clara Mason looked younger than he expected. She wore modest clothes, had a neat hairstyle, and had thin fingers but calloused hands. She was not an office worker. He didn't know what exactly aroused his interest, whether it was the tone of her voice or her direct gaze. Her resume listed experience in pediatrics, certifications in respiratory therapy and caring for children with chronic conditions. Her references were impeccable. But it wasn't about the paperwork. There was a strange mixture of softness and firmness about her that he couldn't ignore. During the interview, which took place in the library on the 2nd floor, he asked a question that usually served as a trap. "Have you ever lost someone you cared for?" Clara looked straight at him without averting her gaze and replied quietly but firmly, "My younger brother. He died in my arms when I was a teenager. Since then I'm not afraid of pain. Only inaction." He didn't know what to say. Usually, candidates mumbled, avoided the topic of death, or resorted to superficial phrases. She didn't hide. He hired her. The terms were clearly spelled out and agreed upon in advance. Full access to the cameras, daily reports on respiratory indicators, no sentimentality. She agreed without objection. The next morning she showed up at the house at 7 o'clock sharp as agreed. Her bag was inconspicuous, her clothes practical. Elliot, awakened by his morning cough, greeted her with caution. But Clara, without making any unnecessary movements, sat down next to him, suggested a game of submarine captain, and smoothly began her breathing exercises. Jonathan watched them through the screen as if they were an experiment, trying to figure out when the breakdown would begin. But it didn't. On the contrary, the child gradually relaxed, and by midday he even laughed as he listened to Clara's story about a sea salmon that could dive its nose into bubbles. This laughter echoed through the corridors of the house, which had long since forgotten joy. For the first time in many months, Jonathan did not intervene. He just watched, silently, with a cup of long cold coffee in his hand. And he thought that perhaps, for the first time, he had allowed someone to get close to him. Even if it was under the watchful eye of cameras. With each passing day, Clara Mason became more and more a natural part of the Greaves household. She didn't impose herself, didn't invade anyone's personal space, didn't ask unnecessary questions, but her every action was thoughtful and aimed at one thing: making Elliot feel safe, where his illness wasn't the center of the universe. Morning inhalations became a game. First they launched a rocket, turned on the nebulizer, then pretended that the steam was clouds through which Captain Elliot was flying his airship. Instead of a medical ritual, it became a quest in which the child was not a patient, but the main character. The meditations that Clara introduced in the second week were wrapped in a nautical theme. Elliot sat on the floor wrapped in a warm blanket while Clara gently talked about coral reefs and the sounds of the underwater world. He breathed in time with her voice, closing his eyes and imagining his body floating through calm waters where there was no pain or coughing. Sometimes she turned on background murmurs, something between the sound of waves and the breath of the wind. Jonathan, watching this through the cameras, at first just snorted, children's fairy tales. But later, when his son's breathing stabilized, even his skepticism began to crack. He increasingly stayed at home, citing the need to check reports, study camera settings and review medication logistics. In reality, he was simply finding excuses to be around her. Sometimes he would walk past the room where Clara was reading to Elliot aloud and linger at the door. Sometimes he would go down to the kitchen when she was brewing herbal tea and ask her about the ingredients with feigned seriousness. She would answer dryly, to the point, showing neither fear nor compliance. He knew it didn't scare her. That was what bothered him the most. One evening, leafing through his son's sketchbook, Jonathan noticed a strange drawing, 3 figures. He immediately understood, one tall, one small, and the third, in a bright glow, almost translucent, standing slightly apart. When he cautiously asked Elliot who they were, the boy replied, "Dad, it's me and you, and a bright woman. She's always there. It's Mom." Jonathan couldn't say a word for a long time. Rachel, who had disappeared in the smoke of that terrible night, still lived in her son's imagination. But the main thing was that the child was now drawing not only himself but also others. A few days later, Clara cautiously raised the issue that Jonathan had feared from the beginning. "I'd like to take Elliot out on the porch for a couple of minutes. The morning sun and fresh air might improve his oxygen saturation." He reacted sharply, almost aggressively, "No. Outside there's humidity, pollen, risks. Any change in conditions is a threat." Clara said nothing in response. But the next morning she placed a printout of Elliot's breathing readings for the past 7 days on his desk. The graphs clearly showed that during their games and meditations, his blood oxygen levels stabilized better than after inhalations. He read everything silently to the end. The paper trembled in his hands, not out of anger, but because it was so difficult to admit that she was right. A couple of hours later he said briefly, "Only the veranda. And no longer than 20 minutes. If there are any deviations, go inside immediately." She nodded. The first walk passed almost without words. Clara sat down next to him on the swing, covered Elliot with a blanket, and told him how the sun helps plants breathe. The child listened, his eyes closed against the light, but he did not cough. There was no alarming sound from the monitor. Only the rustling of leaves and the occasional bird call broke the silence. From that day on, something intangible began to change in the house. The smell of baking returned to the kitchen. Clara baked simple oatmeal cookies, insisting that the child should associate food not with obligation but with comfort. Pieces of music began to drift out of Elliot's room. Clara played soothing tracks that helped with breathing, and they clapped along to the beat together. Jonathan was walking through the corridors of the house when he suddenly caught himself thinking that, for the first time in 3 years, he could hear not the echoes of loss, but the echoes of life. The air had changed, not because of the filters but because of the presence of something real. He no longer checked the camera recordings every hour. Sometimes he forgot to turn on the screen at all. But when he did, he lingered longer than he intended. Especially on the frames where Elliot was laughing. And where Clara looked at him as if he were already safe. That night, thunder shook the walls of the old mansion, as if trying to tear frozen memories from them. The wind howled between the columns and rain pounded on the windows, as if someone were banging on them from outside, demanding to be let in. Jonathan did not like thunderstorms. Ever since Rachel had been taken by fire on a night like this, any rolling echo caused him to panic. His heart raced, his thoughts became confused, and his palms became clammy. But worst of all, as always, was how Elliot felt. Closer to midnight, the sensor went off. A sharp drop in oxygen levels, rapid heartbeat, irregular breathing. Jonathan rushed upstairs before the alarm sounded. He knew that it was the storm that triggered these attacks, as if the boy's body remembered more than his mind. He entered the room where the star projector glowed dimly, reflecting a faint light on Elliot's damp skin. The boy was wheezing, his whole body tense, and Clara was already standing nearby, holding an inhaler, unable to get the child to breathe properly. She glanced at Jonathan, her expression neither pleading nor panicked, just urgent. "Come here. Sit behind him. Hold him. Breathe with him." Jonathan froze at first. He hadn't touched his son since he was discharged from intensive care. All he did was watch, check, measure, count. But now there was no time for reflection. Jonathan left to answer the phone, and Clara decided to sort through an old box in the storage room on the second floor. According to the housekeeper, it contained spare filters for the humidifier. Opening the lid, she saw old papers, film, and a charred map. In the center was a clear rectangle, red marker notes, and a set of numbers, something between coordinates and a code. The paper was brittle with age and the edge was scorched by fire, but that was what caught Clara's attention. The map clearly referred to the internal layout of the house. Old wiring, technical corridors, hand-drawn zones. When Jonathan entered the hall and saw the map in her hands, his face changed. He instantly snatched the paper, clenched it in his fist, and gave her a look full of rage. You had no right. You were digging into a past that you weren't a part of. Leave. Immediately. His voice was as cold as January ice. Clara stood still, not moving. There was no fear on her face, only determination. You're not afraid of the map or me or even the fire. You're afraid that your son will grow up without ever knowing the truth. You're hiding the past not from the world, from him. He looks at the photos, listens to the stories, but still thinks that his mother just left. You're not protecting him, you're shielding him from the pain he feels every night when there's thunder outside the window. Jonathan wanted to say something, but only one question echoed in his head. Could it be that this was how it all began, with one locked drawer, one unspoken word? He turned away, but for the first time he did not order the guards to escort her out. Clara stood in the hall, surrounded by old clocks and portraits, as if in the middle of a battlefield. She already knew, leaving was easy. But staying meant being ready to walk through the flames. Again. The morning came slowly, as if it couldn't bring itself to enter the house where everything had come to an end the day before. The rain had stopped, but the sky over Charleston remained gloomy and heavy, as if reflecting the mood of the people inside the old Greaves mansion. Jonathan had spent the night in his study, unable to sleep. He didn't believe Clara would leave. But he didn't know how he would react if she did show up. She showed up. At exactly 7 in the morning. In the same modest coat, with the same bag over her shoulder, as if nothing had changed. He opened the door himself. And instead of reproach or indignation, he heard only one thing: Elliot can't do without me. He'll wake up and start looking for me. And he won't find anyone who knows how afraid he is of thunder. Jonathan stepped aside, silently letting her into the hall. Later, in the living room, she sat down on the edge of the chair opposite him, not lowering her gaze or making any attempt to justify herself. When I was a girl, she began quietly, I had a younger brother, Liam. We slept in the same room. One night, the wiring caught fire. I heard the crackling, but I didn't wake up. I didn't get up. I didn't scream. My mother pulled me out, but they didn't make it in time for Liam. Since then, I've learned one thing. Pain is not something to be afraid of. Inaction is worse. I won't leave until Elliot is safe. And it's not about his lungs, Jonathan. It's about how he hugs his mother's photo every night, thinking she just didn't come back from the store. The words sounded harsh but not accusatory. Rather, they sounded like a challenge. Jonathan was silent for a long time. Then he got up, walked across the room and approached the fireplace, where a framed photograph of Rachel stood. He stared at it for a long time before speaking. It wasn't an accident. Rachel and I were preparing documents to leave the project. One of the partners knew he would lose everything. 3 days after we submitted our resignation, a fire broke out in the house. No alarm, no signs of a break-in. Just a short circuit. I'm still looking for any clue. He turned to her, his face stony but his voice sounded tired. Not angry, exhausted. And then Clara took a charred map out of her bag. She unfolded it on the coffee table and pointed to a barely visible area on the diagram. Here, she said, the plan shows a room. An old archive, adjacent to the ventilation unit. According to the diagram, there was an old camera there. But I didn't find a single recording from it. Jonathan frowned. He remembered how, after the fire, the technicians had mentioned a camera that had been written off by mistake. He jumped up as if suddenly awakened and headed for the basement, which no one had looked into for a long time. Clara followed but kept her distance. The old metal cabinet was covered in dust and cobwebs. Jonathan took out a bunch of keys, unlocked the cabinet, and began rummaging through the old storage devices. Among the dusty boxes he found a flash drive with a handwritten note. Ventilation, camera 7. He didn't remember anyone analyzing it. Returning upstairs, he plugged it into his laptop and the screen flickered. The video was barely discernible, but after a few seconds they both saw a figure in a hooded jacket. The man was fiddling with wires near the distribution box. Then there was a flash, a spark, and a signal went down the wire. The fire did not start accidentally. Jonathan closed his laptop as if afraid that the image would smell like smoke. He looked up at Clara. "Thank you," was all he could say. The next day, the flash drive was handed over to a detective with whom Jonathan had been in contact for a long time. 2 days later, his former partner, Arthur Lawson, was arrested in Miami while attempting to fly to Panama. The news of the arrest came just as Jonathan and Clara were taking Elliot out onto the porch. The sun was shining through a light haze, the air was fresh, and the boy, wrapped in a blanket, was telling them how he had seen a star at night that flashed and winked. Jonathan looked at him and thought that for the first time in 3 years, this house had ceased to be a tomb. The fire, which had seemed like a curse, turned out to be a clue. And the key to the truth was provided not by a lawyer or an investigator, but by a woman who had once failed to save her brother and now refused to abandon someone else's son. In the evening, when the sun had already sunk below the horizon and the air above Charleston was filled with a quiet coolness, 3 people, Jonathan, Clara, and Elliot, stood on a wooden bridge leading to a quiet backwater. On this day exactly 3 years ago, Rachel had died in the fire that had become a watershed in their lives. And now, for the first time since then, the Greaves family had decided to hold a memorial on the water, a ceremony of light, where each lantern symbolized memory, hope, and gratitude. Small paper boats with candle-shaped lights waited on the shore, and next to them was a box with notes that people had been asked to write in advance, words they hadn't had time to say or that they wanted to convey there, in the silence, beyond the realm of the human. Clara helped Elliot lower the first lantern into the water. The boy leaned over, carefully holding the boat so that it would not tip over. His note was short: "Thank you, Mom. I remember everything." Other lanterns followed, and soon the water in the bay lit up with soft lights, as if stars that had fallen from the sky had decided to rest on its surface. Jonathan stood a little way off, clutching a small wooden box darkened by time in his palm. He opened it, and inside, on a velvet lining, lay a ring. Not gold, no diamonds. Instead of a stone, there was a piece of sea glass, the color of a sea wave, smooth and sparkling. It was the only item that survived the fire in Rachel's bedroom, a fragment of a vase found among the ashes, which she considered to be of special significance. She always said that sea glass was a fragment of pain that water had made beautiful. He approached Clara, who was helping Elliot adjust his shirt collar at that moment. The light from the lanterns reflected in her eyes, making them even warmer. Jonathan took her by the hand and led her to the edge of the bridge, where he and Rachel had stood many years ago, making their first promises. He knelt down in front of Clara and, without any drama or grand words, simply opened the box with the ring. At that moment, the sky suddenly lit up with the last glimmers of sunset, and the water sparkled with color, as if time itself had decided to stop and watch them. She didn't cry, but her fingers trembled as he slipped the ring onto her finger. Elliot ran toward them from the shore, waving his arms joyfully. He ran up, looked at Clara, then at his father, and then, without waiting for questions, said, "Now there are 3 of us again. And Mom isn't alone. She's smiling down from heaven." Jonathan sat down next to him, hugged him, and for the first time in many months allowed himself to close his eyes, not from fatigue but from peace of mind. He didn't know if he deserved a second chance like this, but he knew he would fight for it. They returned home after dark. The mansion, illuminated by soft lighting, no longer resembled a fortress. It was simply a home. Tired, Elliot went up to his room, and when Clara, as usual, wanted to turn on the monitor to check the cameras, Jonathan gently stopped her. He went into the security office, looked at the screen where his son's bedroom was lit up, and pressed the off button. The monitor went dark. The silence became different. No longer ringing, alarming, but full of trust. He realized that there are moments that cannot be watched from the outside. They need to be lived inside. Early the next morning, Clara found a new letter in the memorial room, neatly placed next to Rachel's photos. It was written on thick paper in familiar, neat handwriting. It contained only a few lines: "Rachel, thank you for giving me a heart that never stops loving. Now it loves even more. Jonathan." Next to it was a photograph, a recent one. It showed 3 people, Jonathan, Clara, and Elliot, standing by the water, with burning lanterns in the background and a soft glow from the stars in the sky. Memories were still preserved in this house. But now there was also hope. Not as a ghost of the past but as the living breath of the present. The house, where once there was only ashes, was filled with light again. Light that does not blind, but shows the way forward, to the shore where they are waiting for you. Dear viewers, thank you for being with us. Subscribe to the channel, like us, and be sure to write in the comments what you think of this story. Don't forget to click on the bell, so you don't miss new interesting stories. See you soon.